25 years after losing his beloved in a tragic accident, a millionaire is paralyzed when he sees a waitress identical to her. He approached, and rain lashed against the windows of the Carter mansion like angry fists demanding entry. Michael Carter stood at his office window, watching lightning split the night sky. The flash illuminated his reflection, a haunted man with silver-streaked dark hair and deep lines etched around his eyes that had once sparkled with joy, now dulled by decades of grief. 25 years, he whispered, fingers tracing the date on the sterling silver desk calendar. A quarter-century since the accident that had stolen Sophia from him. His Sophia, with her radiant smile and the half-moon birthmark near her right wrist. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in, Jack," Michael said, without turning. The door opened, revealing a man in his 60s, lean and dignified in his chauffeur's uniform. Despite the late hour, Jack Reynolds had been more than an employee for over 30 years. He was the closest thing Michael had to a friend. "It's nearly midnight." "Sir," Jack said, his Boston accent still noticeable after decades in the Midwest. "You promised you'd eat something today." Michael turned, offering a hollow smile. "Did I?" "You did." Jack remained by the door, unfazed by his employer's attempt at dismissal. "I've taken the liberty of making reservations at Luciana's, the small Italian place on Maple Street. Cancel them, I'm not hungry." Jack cleared his throat. "With all due respect, sir, Mrs. Sophia wouldn't want—" "Don't." Michael's voice hardened. "Don't tell me what she would want." An uncomfortable silence settled between them before Jack spoke again, softer this time. "It's been 25 years, Mr. Carter." Michael turned back to the window, his reflection now a ghost against the storm-darkened glass. "Precisely why I'd prefer to be alone tonight. The reservation is for 12:30. The car will be waiting." Jack stepped back, closing the door quietly behind him. Left alone, Michael moved to the mahogany bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound album. The pages fell open to a familiar photograph, Sophia on their wedding day, 23, and radiant in ivory lace, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, those striking green eyes looking at him with such love that even now, it stole his breath. 25 years, he repeated, tracing her face with a trembling finger. The streetlights of downtown glowed like halos in the rain as the black Bentley glided to a stop in front of Luciana's. It was a modest establishment, tucked between a bookstore and a vintage record shop. Not Michael's usual caliber, but Jack insisted they made the best risotto outside of Milan. "I'll wait here, sir," Jack said, turning slightly in the driver's seat. "Take your time." Michael nodded, tightening his scarf before stepping into the downpour. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. Shaking raindrops from his coat, the restaurant was warm, filled with the aroma of garlic and basil. Only a few tables were occupied this late. A young couple lost in conversation, an elderly man reading a newspaper, a group of friends celebrating something with wine and laughter. A middle-aged woman approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Table for one, sir." "My driver called ahead. Reservation for Carter." Her eyes widened slightly at the name. "Of course, Mr. Carter. This way, please." She led him to a corner table, partially hidden by a decorative grape trellis. Private. Jack knew his preferences well. "Your server will be right with you," the woman said, handing him a menu before hurrying away. Michael didn't open it. Instead, he found himself staring at the rain streaming down the window, creating distorted patterns of the street beyond. He barely registered the approaching footsteps until a voice broke through his reverie. "Good evening. Can I start you with something to drink?" Something in the voice, a particular musical quality, made Michael look up sharply. The menu slipped from his fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Standing beside his table was a young woman, perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She had striking green eyes set in a heart-shaped face, high cheekbones, and a gentle curve to her lips. But what froze the blood in Michael's veins was the small, crescent-shaped birthmark near her right wrist as she bent to retrieve his fallen menu. It was impossible. Utterly impossible. "Sir, are you all right?" The young woman, her name tag read Olivia, was looking at him with concern now. Michael couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the slight tilt of her head as she waited for his response. Water, please," he finally managed, his voice barely audible over the rain and soft Italian music. She nodded, that familiar half-smile playing at her lips before she turned away. Michael watched her every movement, feeling as though he'd been struck by the lightning that continued to flash outside, the way she walked, that same graceful, slightly hesitant step, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear with her left hand, never her right, like Sophia. Exactly like Sophia. His phone buzzed, mercifully breaking his spiral of disbelief. A text from Benjamin, his son. "Annual reports need your signature. Where are you?" Michael stared at the message from the son he barely knew. A painful reminder of his failed attempt at moving on after Sophia. His second marriage had been brief, loveless, a desperate bid to fill a void that couldn't be filled. Benjamin had been the only good thing to come of it. And even then, Michael had failed him as a father, unable to see past the ghost of his first love. "Here's your water, sir," Olivia returned, placing a glass before him. "Are you ready to order? Or do you need a few minutes?" Michael looked up at her, this impossible mirror image, and felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "Have we met before?" he asked, knowing how cliché the question must sound. She studied him, her head tilting slightly to the right, just as Sophia's always had when she was thinking. "I don't believe so," she replied with a polite smile. "I think I'd remember meeting Michael Carter. Your building downtown has your name on it, after all." "Of course." He cleared his throat. "I'll have the risotto, please." "Excellent choice. Chef Luciana's specialty." She wrote it down, and as her sleeve pulled back, Michael caught another glimpse of that crescent-shaped mark. "That birthmark," he said before he could stop himself. "On your wrist." Olivia glanced down, unconsciously touching it with her other hand. "Oh, this. Yes, I've had it since birth. My mother used to say it was a kiss from the moon." She paused, something flickering across her expression. "At least, that's what Grace told me." "Grace? My adoptive mother?" Olivia seemed surprised at her own candor. "I'm sorry, that was unprofessional. I'll put your order in right away." As she walked away, Michael felt the world shifting beneath him. Adoptive mother, the birthmark, the resemblance that went beyond coincidence. His hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. Outside, thunder crashed, and the lights flickered momentarily, casting the restaurant in shadow. In that brief darkness, Michael could have sworn he heard Sophia's laughter. Soft and melodic, somewhere just beyond reach, the storm of the past was coming back to life, and Michael Carter was caught directly in its path. 3 days passed before Michael returned to Luciana's. 3 days of restless nights and distracted days, his mind constantly drifting to the young waitress with Sophia's face. He'd barely touched the risotto that night, leaving a generous tip before hurrying back to the sanctuary of his car, where Jack had waited patiently. "Did you enjoy your meal, sir?" Jack had asked. Drive was all Michael could manage now, as his Bentley pulled up to the curb outside the restaurant at precisely 7 p.m. Jack glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Will you be requiring the car later tonight, Mr. Carter?" "I'm not sure. Wait an hour. Then check with me." Michael straightened his tie. "If I don't answer, you can head home." The restaurant was busier tonight. A hostess with a bright smile led him to the same corner table. Michael scanned the room for Olivia but didn't see her. Disappointment settled in his chest, heavier than he expected. "Good evening, Mr. Carter." An older waitress approached his table. "My name is Diane. I'll be your server tonight." "Is Olivia working?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. Diane's smile faltered slightly. "She's here, but on break at the moment. Would you like me to let her know you're asking for her?" "No, that won't be... I can serve Mr. Carter's table, Diane." Olivia appeared beside them, notepad in hand. She wore the same black uniform as the other servers, but on her, it seemed to transform into something elegant. Tonight, her hair was loose around her shoulders, making the resemblance to Sophia even more striking. "If you're sure, honey," Diane patted Olivia's arm before leaving them. "You came back," Olivia said, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "The risotto was excellent," Michael replied, not meeting her eyes. "Was it? You barely touched it." A slight smile played at her lips. "What can I get you tonight?" "Wine, red, whatever you recommend." She nodded and turned to go. "Olivia?" he called after her. She looked back, eyebrows raised. I apologize for my behavior the other night. I was distracted. No apology necessary, Mr. Carter. As she walked away, Michael watched her interact with other patrons. The easy smile, the attentive nod, the way she used her hands when explaining specials. Every gesture was hauntingly familiar, yet uniquely her own. His phone buzzed. Benjamin again. Meeting with Tokyo investors tomorrow. Need briefing from you tonight. Michael sighed, typing a quick reply promising to call later. His relationship with his son was strained at best, non-existent at worst. Benjamin had joined Carter Enterprises straight out of business school, driven to prove himself worthy of the family name despite his father's emotional absence. Michael knew he should be proud. Instead, he felt only a vague sense of regret for all the years lost between them. Olivia returned with his wine. Here you go, Barolo. 2018. One of our best. Join me. The invitation surprised them both. I'm working, Mr. Carter. Just for a moment, please. Something in his tone made her hesitate, then nod. She slipped into the chair across from him, setting her notepad aside. My break's almost over, she warned. Michael studied her face in the candlelight. The resemblance was uncanny, yet there were differences too. Olivia's expressions were more open, less guarded than Sophia's had been. Her eyes held a searching quality, as if she were constantly looking for something just beyond her reach. How long have you worked here? He asked, taking a sip of wine. About 8 months. Olivia glanced at her wristwatch. A simple, inexpensive thing. Nothing like the diamond-encrusted pieces Sophia had favored. It's a good job while I figure things out. Figure what things out? She hesitated. My life, I guess. My history. You mentioned you were adopted. A shadow crossed her face. Yes. Grace took me in when I was 7. Before that, I was in the system. And your birth parents? Unknown. She traced the outline of her birthmark absently. I've been trying to find information, but it's complicated, especially now that Grace is not well. Michael's interest sharpened. I'm sorry to hear that. Is she ill? Terminal cancer. Olivia's voice remained steady, but her eyes betrayed her pain. She doesn't have much time left. I'm sorry, he said again. Meaning it. Olivia nodded, then seemed to shake off the heaviness. Why all the questions, Mr. Carter? I'm just a waitress. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. Your wife. At his startled look, she added, I Googled you after you left the other night. Michael Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises. Widowed young. 1 son. She studied him. The articles mentioned Sophia Carter died in a plane crash 25 years ago. 25 years and 3 days ago, Michael corrected automatically. I'm sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago. The practiced response fell from his lips. Hollow as always. Was it? From the way you looked at me, I'd say it feels like yesterday. Her perception unsettled him before he could respond. A commotion near the entrance drew their attention. An elderly woman had entered, supporting herself on a walking cane, her face drawn with exhaustion. Grace? Olivia stood abruptly. What are you doing here? You should be resting. I needed to see you, dear. The woman's voice was weak, but determined. There's something I need to give you. Something I should have given you years ago. Olivia hurried to help her to a chair, concern etched across her features. Diane, can you get some water, Mr. Carter? I'm sorry, but go, Michael said. Take care of her. As Olivia led the frail woman to a quieter corner, Michael caught fragments of their conversation. Can't wait any longer. Should have told you sooner. The truth about how I found you. Curiosity piqued. Michael signaled for the check. As he waited, his gaze drifted back to Olivia and the elderly woman. Grace was pressing something into Olivia's palm, closing her fingers around it. Whatever it was, it made Olivia's face drain of color. Outside the restaurant, Benjamin Carter leaned against his Tesla, scrolling through his phone. At 32, he was the spitting image of Michael at the same age. Tall, dark-haired, with features that women found irresistible and men found intimidating. Unlike his father, however, Benjamin's eyes held a sharp, calculating edge. He looked up as the restaurant door opened, expecting to see his father. Instead, he watched as a striking young woman emerged, supporting an elderly lady to a waiting taxi. The young woman's profile in the streetlight made him pause. When Michael finally exited the restaurant, Benjamin pushed away from his car. "I got tired of waiting for your call," he said. His tone clipped. "Thought I'd find you at the office, not dining alone on the anniversary week of Mother's." He stopped himself. Of Sophia's death, Michael barely glanced at his son. His attention was fixed on the departing taxi. "Who was that woman you were staring at?" Benjamin asked, following his father's gaze. "No one," Michael answered too quickly. "A waitress." Benjamin studied his father's face, noting the tension around his eyes, the slight flush that wasn't entirely attributable to the wine. "She looked familiar," he said carefully. "Did she?" Michael turned away. "We have work to discuss." As they walked to their respective cars, Benjamin cast one last look in the direction the taxi had gone. Something about the young woman nagged at him, a memory just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. In the back of the taxi, Olivia uncurled her fingers, staring down at the object Grace had given her, a gold medallion on a delicate chain. Tarnished with age, the inscription, though worn, was still legible. "To SC, my eternal love, MC." "Where did you get this?" Olivia whispered. "It was around your neck," Grace replied, her voice fading as exhaustion took over. "The night I found you in the snow." "She's a fraud." Benjamin paced the length of his father's office, hands clasped behind his back. "It's the oldest con in the book." 3 days had passed since their encounter outside Luciana's. 3 days of watching his father grow increasingly distracted during meetings, checking his phone constantly, canceling appointments to disappear for hours. It hadn't taken much digging to discover where he was going. "You don't know what you're talking about," Michael replied, not looking up from the financial report on his desk. "A waitress who happens to look like your dead wife, who suddenly appears exactly 25 years after the accident." Benjamin stopped pacing. "Come on, Dad. You're smarter than this." Michael's jaw tightened. "I didn't say she looked like Sophia. You didn't have to. I saw her, remember?" Benjamin leaned forward, palms flat against the mahogany desk. "And I saw your face when you watched her leave." A heavy silence fell between them. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below, a testament to everything Michael had built in the wake of his grief. Carter Tower stood as the centerpiece of the skyline, 40 stories of glass and steel that housed the headquarters of Carter Enterprises. "What do you want, Benjamin?" Michael finally asked, setting the report aside. "I want you to see reason before you do something you'll regret." Michael's eyes hardened. "Like what?" "Like getting taken advantage of by some girl who's obviously researched your past and is planning to exploit your grief. Is that what you think is happening?" Michael stood, his voice dangerously quiet. "That I'm some senile old man being manipulated by a pretty face. I think you're a man who never properly dealt with his loss," Benjamin said, refusing to back down. "And that makes you vulnerable." They stared at each other across the desk, the resemblance between them momentarily stark. The same stubborn set to their jaws, the same intensity in their eyes. "I have a meeting," Michael said, breaking the standoff. "You can see yourself out." After his father left, Benjamin remained in the office, frustration buzzing beneath his skin. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the one he needed. William Harris, private investigator, a man known for his discretion and thoroughness, qualities Benjamin had appreciated during previous corporate espionage cases. The call connected on the third ring. "Harris," a gruff voice answered. "It's Benjamin Carter. I have a job for you." Dorothy Jenkins sat in her modest living room, knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a baby blanket for her newest grandchild. At 72, her hands weren't as steady as they once were, but the familiar motion soothed her. After 3 decades as head housekeeper for the Carter family, retirement had been an adjustment. She missed the order and purpose of managing the mansion, though not the memories that haunted its halls. The evening news droned in the background, something about Carter Enterprises' latest acquisition. The sound of Michael's name made her look up. The camera panned to show him leaving a restaurant with an attractive younger woman. The knitting needles stilled in Dorothy's hands. She reached for her glasses, cleaning them hurriedly before peering at the screen. The segment had already moved on to weather, but what she'd seen, or thought she'd seen, sent a chill down her spine. That face. It couldn't be. Dorothy set her knitting aside with trembling hands, and moved to the small desk in the corner of the room. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a photo album, its leather cover worn soft with age. She'd kept it against her better judgment, telling herself it was out of loyalty to the family she'd served for so long. The pages fell open to a familiar photograph, Michael and Sophia on their wedding day. Young and radiantly happy, Dorothy stared at Sophia's face, the high cheekbones, the curve of her smile, the particular way her head tilted slightly to one side. The woman on the news had the same features, the same bearing. "It's not possible," she whispered to the empty room. But the resemblance had been undeniable, and it wasn't the first impossible thing Dorothy had witnessed in connection with the Carter family. She closed the album and reached for her phone. Her finger hovered over Michael's contact information before she set it back down. What would she say? That she'd seen a ghost on the evening news? That the past they'd all tried so hard to bury seemed to be clawing its way back to the surface? No. Better to be certain first. Dorothy returned the album to its drawer and pulled out a small notebook instead. There was an address written inside, a place she hadn't visited in years, a place connected to secrets she'd sworn to take to her grave. Olivia stared at the ceiling of her small apartment, sleep eluding her despite the late hour. The gold medallion lay on her nightstand, catching the moonlight that filtered through her curtains. To SC, my eternal love, MC. The initials had been haunting her for days. MC could be Michael Carter and SC, Sophia Carter. The coincidence seemed too great. Yet what other explanation could there be? Grace had been too weak to explain further that night, and her condition had deteriorated rapidly since then. The hospice nurse had warned Olivia that the end was near, that she should prepare herself. But how could she prepare when so many questions remained unanswered? Olivia turned onto her side, her gaze falling on the collection of sketchbooks stacked on her desk. Drawing had always been her refuge. From the lonely days in foster care to the uncertain present lately, her sketches had taken a strange turn. Mountain landscapes she'd never seen, a small plane against a stormy sky, a woman's face half turned away. A sudden noise from outside her window startled her. Olivia sat up, listening intently. It came again, the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter, heart pounding. She moved cautiously to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. The street below appeared empty, but as she watched, a shadow detached itself from the doorway across the street. A tall figure walked quickly away. Something held close to their chest. Olivia stepped back, unsettled. Was she being paranoid? Or had someone been watching her apartment? Her phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Stay away from Michael Carter. You're playing a dangerous game. Olivia stared at the screen, a chill spreading through her body. She hadn't told anyone about her encounters with Michael. Not even Grace. How could someone know? And what game did they think she was playing? With shaking fingers, she deleted the message and set her phone back down. The medallion gleamed accusingly in the moonlight, whatever connection it represented to Michael Carter and his past. Someone clearly didn't want her pursuing it. Olivia picked up the necklace, the gold warm against her palm. She should stay away. Forget the strange coincidences. Focus on caring for Grace in her final days. That would be the sensible choice. Yet even as she thought it, Olivia knew she couldn't let it go. The emptiness she'd felt her entire life, the questions about where she came from, the strange dreams of mountains and snow, they all seemed connected to this medallion and to Michael Carter. In the morning, she would go to the hospital to sit with Grace. She would bring her sketchbook and try again to get answers while there was still time. And then, perhaps, she would return to Luciana's for her evening shift, knowing there was a chance Michael might come back. Outside her building, William Harris reviewed the photos on his digital camera, satisfaction evident on his weathered face. Benjamin Carter would be pleased with his initial findings. The girl was definitely hiding something. The way she'd stared at that necklace made that clear enough. Now he just needed to figure out what game she was playing and how far she was willing to go to trap one of the richest men in the city. Benjamin unlocked the door to his father's private storage facility, a climate-controlled room in the basement of Carter Tower. He rarely came here. This archive of his father's past was something Michael guarded jealously, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The room smelled of paper and time. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, organized with Michael's characteristic precision. Corporate records, personal correspondence, family photographs, Benjamin moved past these to the section labeled simply SC, Sophia Carter's life, boxed and catalogued. He pulled on white cotton gloves from a dispenser by the door. Whatever his motives, he wouldn't risk damaging anything. His father might forgive many things, but not that. Benjamin started with the accident investigation files. The private plane crash had been extensively documented, partly due to Michael's wealth and influence, partly due to the unusual circumstances. The aircraft had gone down in a remote area of the Aspen Mountains during a snowstorm. Search and rescue teams hadn't reached the site until nearly 12 hours after the crash. By then, there had been nothing to save. The official report cited mechanical failure as the probable cause. Benjamin flipped through the technical analyses, witness statements, and recovery operation details. Nothing seemed particularly suspicious until he reached a folder marked Personal Effects Recovered. Inside was an inventory list and several photographs. Most items were unremarkable: clothing, jewelry, a leather-bound journal too damaged by fire and water to be legible, but one entry caught his attention. Item: Darrier 17, gold medallion on chain, inscription 2SC, My Eternal Love, MC, status, not recovered. Benjamin frowned. The medallion had been documented but never found, yet he distinctly remembered seeing such a necklace in family photographs. His father had commissioned it as a wedding gift for Sophia. He moved to another box, this one containing photo albums. The wedding album confirmed his memory. There was the medallion, gleaming at Sophia's throat as she and Michael exchanged vows. Benjamin photographed the relevant pages with his phone before continuing his search. In a folder marked Correspondence, he found something unexpected: a series of letters from the investigation team to Michael, dated several months after the official inquiry had closed. The letters referenced anomalies in the wreckage pattern and possible evidence of tampering. The investigator had requested additional funding to pursue these leads privately, which Michael had apparently provided. The final letter in the sequence was cryptic. Mr. Carter, following our discovery regarding the aircraft's fuel line, I strongly recommend you consider the possibility that the crash was not accidental. I await your instructions on how to proceed with this sensitive information. There was no record of Michael's response, or of any further investigation. Benjamin sat back on his heels, mind racing. Had someone deliberately caused Sophia's crash? And if so, why had his father apparently abandoned the investigation? His phone buzzed. A text from William Harris. Need to meet. Found something interesting about our waitress friend. Benjamin carefully returned everything to its proper place, ensuring the room looked undisturbed. As he locked the door behind him, a new suspicion took root. What if this Olivia person wasn't running a simple con? What if her resemblance to Sophia was connected to these unanswered questions about the crash? You're doing it again, Michael said softly. Olivia looked up from the coffee she'd been stirring mindlessly. Doing what? That thing with your right eyebrow? Arching it when you're deep in thought? Michael smiled. Sophia used to do the same thing. They sat in a quiet corner of a cafe 2 blocks from the hospital where Grace was now receiving round-the-clock care. It was their 3rd meeting in a week, each one less coincidental than the last. You shouldn't say things like that, Olivia said, but there was no real admonishment in her tone. Why not? It's true. Because it's... She struggled to find the right word. Unsettling, the way you look at me sometimes. Like you're seeing someone else. Michael had the grace to look apologetic. I'm sorry. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. You don't. Not exactly. Olivia hesitated, then reached into her purse and withdrew the gold medallion. I need to ask you about this. The color drained from Michael's face as he stared at the necklace. Where did you get that? Grace gave it to me. She said it was around my neck when she found me. Olivia watched his reaction carefully. It's yours, isn't it? You gave it to your wife. Michael reached for the medallion with trembling fingers, touching it as if it might dissolve into smoke. This was lost in the crash. They never recovered it. What crash? The plane crash that killed Sophia. Michael looked up, his eyes searching her face. You said Grace found you. Where? When? In the snow, she said. I was just a baby. Olivia withdrew the medallion from his grasp. She's been too weak to explain more, but it must have been around 25 years ago. I turned 25 in January. January 12th. Olivia blinked in surprise. Yes, how did you know? That was Sophia's birthday too. Michael's voice had grown hoarse. Olivia, I need to know everything Grace has told you about where she found you. Not much. She said it was a miracle, finding me in the snow. That's why she named me Olivia. It means peace, she always said. I brought peace to her life after her husband died. Olivia twisted the medallion's chain between her fingers. She mentioned mountains once, I think. Was it in Colorado, near Aspen? I don't know, maybe. Olivia frowned. Why would that matter? Before Michael could answer, Olivia's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. It's the hospital, I should take this. As she stepped away to answer the call, Michael stared at the medallion she'd left on the table. It was impossible. Completely impossible. Yet the evidence was right in front of him. The necklace he'd given Sophia on their wedding day, lost in the crash that took her life. Now somehow in the possession of a young woman who shared her birthday, her mannerisms, even her physical features. Olivia returned, her face pale. I have to go. Grace's condition has worsened. Michael stood. I'll drive you. No. She shook her head firmly. I appreciate everything you've done, Michael, but I need to do this alone. She scooped up the medallion and hurried out of the cafe. Michael watched her go, feeling as though he was losing Sophia all over again. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unfamiliar number. She's not who you think she is. Meet me at the old boathouse, 8 p.m. Come alone. DJ. Dorothy Jenkins, his former housekeeper, who had left his employ abruptly after Sophia's death, claiming she needed to care for an ailing relative. Michael had always suspected there was more to her departure, but he'd been too consumed by grief to question it. Now, it seemed, the past was demanding to be confronted from all directions. In her hospital room, Grace Watson lay against white pillows, her skin nearly as pale as the linens. She smiled weakly as Olivia entered. You brought your sketchbook, she observed, her voice barely above a whisper. Olivia nodded, taking the chair beside the bed. I wanted to show you my new drawings. She opened the book to reveal a series of sketches. Snow-covered mountains, a small aircraft, a lake reflecting pine trees, places she'd never been but couldn't stop drawing. Grace, Olivia said gently, I need you to tell me the truth about where you found me, about this. She held up the medallion. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I thought I had more time. Please, while you still can. The older woman closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. It was near Aspen. I was visiting my sister. There had been reports of a plane crash in the mountains. Everyone said there were no survivors. But there was me, Olivia prompted. Not at the crash site, no. Grace's voice grew fainter. On the road leading away from it, there was a woman. She was distraught, covered in blood. She had you in her arms. She begged me to take you, to raise you as my own. She said it wasn't safe for you to stay with her. Who was she? Did she tell you her name? Grace shook her head, her eyelids growing heavy. Only that your mother had died in the crash, and that the medallion was your birthright. Her breathing became more labored. Find the truth, Olivia, but be careful. Some secrets are buried for a reason. The old boathouse sat at the edge of Carter Lake, a man-made reservoir created when Michael purchased the surrounding acreage to build his country estate. Once a gathering place for summer parties and family outings, it had fallen into disuse after Sophia's death. Michael hadn't visited in years. He arrived early, parking his car a discreet distance away and walking the remainder of the path. The evening was cool, with mist rising from the water's surface. Memories pressed in with each step. Sophia laughing as she tried to row a boat for the first time. A summer evening when they'd slipped away from guests to be alone. Plans they'd made for a family that never materialized. The boathouse door creaked as he pushed it open. The interior was dim, smelling of damp wood and stagnant water. A single lamp burned on a table in the center of the room, illuminating a familiar figure. Dorothy, Michael acknowledged. Stepping inside, the elderly woman stood stiffly, her hands clasped before her. Age had bent her once ramrod posture, but her eyes remained sharp. Mr. Carter, she replied formally, as if they were still employer and employee, rather than two people who'd shared over 20 years under the same roof. Your message was cryptic. What's this about? Dorothy gestured to a chair. Please sit. What I have to tell you isn't easy. Michael remained standing. Is this about Olivia? So that's her name. Dorothy nodded, unsurprised. I saw her on the news with you. The resemblance is uncanny to Sophia. You mean? Yes. Dorothy seemed to choose her words carefully. But also to someone else. Who? Charlotte Walker. The name hit Michael like a physical blow. Charlotte, Sophia's twin sister, the woman who'd cut ties with the family shortly before the wedding, disappearing from their lives completely. What does Charlotte have to do with this? He demanded. Dorothy reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age. I've kept this for 25 years. I should have given it to you then, but I was afraid. She made me promise. Who did, Charlotte? Dorothy nodded, passing him the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, Charlotte holding a baby, perhaps 6 months old. The infant was wrapped in a pink blanket, a small crescent-shaped birthmark visible near its tiny wrist. Charlotte had a child. Michael looked up, confused. I never knew. Few people did. She kept it secret, even from Sophia. Dorothy's voice trembled slightly. The baby's name was Ella. She was on the plane with Sophia that day. Michael sank into the chair, the photograph clutched in his hand. That's not possible. There were only 2 people on that flight, Sophia and the pilot. 3, Dorothy corrected gently. Ella was 8 months pregnant. She wanted to reconcile with Sophia, to tell her about the baby she was carrying, about your niece or nephew. The room seemed to tilt around Michael. Are you saying the baby survived the crash somehow? Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Charlotte found her before the rescue teams arrived. She gave the child to a stranger, a woman named Grace, and made her promise to raise the baby as her own, far away from the Carter name and all it represented. Grace, Michael whispered. Olivia's adoptive mother. Dorothy nodded. I saw Charlotte briefly. After it all happened, she was broken, consumed by guilt. She made me swear never to tell anyone that Ella and her unborn child had been on that plane. She said it was the only way to keep the baby safe. Safe from what? From whom? She wouldn't say. But she was terrified, Mr. Carter. Truly terrified. Michael stared down at the photograph, mind racing. If Dorothy was telling the truth, then Olivia wasn't Sophia reincarnated or some elaborate con artist. She was family. The daughter of Sophia's niece, Ella, his grandniece by marriage. Why now, Dorothy? Why tell me this after all these years? Because the past has found its way back, she said simply. And because I'm old, Mr. Carter. I don't want to take this secret to my grave. Does Charlotte know about Olivia? That she's back in the city. I don't know. I haven't spoken to Charlotte since that day. Dorothy hesitated. But if she does know, she may not be the only one. And that's what worries me. William Harris spread the photos across Benjamin Carter's desk. Surveillance snapshots of Olivia's daily routine. Her apartment building, the restaurant, the hospital she'd been visiting. Most of it's routine stuff, the investigator explained. Work, home, hospital visits. The old lady she's seeing is in hospice care. Terminal cancer. Name's Grace Watson. Former nurse, widow, no children of her own. Benjamin picked up a photo of Olivia entering the hospital. What's her connection to my father? That's where it gets interesting. Harris selected another photograph. This one showing Olivia holding a gold medallion. Recognize this. Benjamin's eyes narrowed. Where did she get that? From the old lady, apparently. I managed to get within earshot during one of their meetings at a cafe. Your father asked where she got it, and she said Grace gave it to her. Said it was around her neck when Grace found her as a baby. Found her? What does that mean? She was abandoned. Adopted at age 7. In foster care before that. No record of birth parents. Harris tapped the photo. But here's the kicker. She was born on January 12th. Same as your father's first wife. And apparently, she was found near Aspen around the time of the crash. Benjamin felt a chill run down his spine. The medallion that should have been lost in the crash. The resemblance to Sophia. The coincidence of birthdays. The unanswered questions in the investigation files. Could she be? He couldn't finish the thought. Related somehow. Harris shrugged. It's possible. The timing fits. But I need more to go on. Keep digging, Benjamin ordered. I want to know exactly who she is and what she wants from my father. After Harris left, Benjamin remained at his desk. Staring at the photographs, he'd been so certain Olivia was running a scam, using her resemblance to Sophia to manipulate his father. But what if there was more to it? What if she was genuinely connected to their family somehow? His office door opened without a knock. Michael entered, looking more shaken than Benjamin had seen him in years. "Cancel your evening plans," his father said. "We need to talk." Benjamin hastily gathered the photographs, but not before Michael caught sight of them. "You had her followed." Anger flashed in Michael's eyes. "You invaded her privacy." "I was trying to protect you," Benjamin defended. "You haven't been thinking clearly since you met her. And what did your spy discover? That she's a hard-working young woman who visits a dying mother figure in the hospital. How sinister." Benjamin hesitated, then laid the photos out again. "He discovered this." He pointed to the medallion. "The necklace you gave Sophia, the one that supposedly went down with the plane." Michael's anger seemed to deflate. He sank into a chair across from Benjamin's desk. "There's more to this than either of us realized," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Dorothy Jenkins contacted me. She has information about the crash, about Sophia and Charlotte, and a baby named Ella who was on the plane that day." Benjamin frowned. "Who's Ella?" "Charlotte's daughter, Sophia's niece." Michael looked up, his eyes haunted. "And according to Dorothy, Ella was pregnant when the plane went down. Very pregnant." Understanding dawned on Benjamin's face. "And you think Olivia—" Michael nodded. "She could be Ella's daughter, my grandniece by marriage." "Family, Benjamin, not some con artist." In his office at the back of a nondescript building across town, William Harris dialed a number he'd hoped never to use again. It rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. Older now, but still recognizable. "It's Harris," he said without preamble. "We have a situation. The girl is back in the picture, and she's found Michael Carter." The line went silent for a long moment. Then, "Keep watching her. Don't let her out of your sight. And whatever you do, don't let her remember. It may be too late for that," Harris warned. "She has the medallion." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll be on the next flight." As Harris ended the call, he moved to his filing cabinet and unlocked the bottom drawer. From it, he withdrew a folder marked simply Walker Carter, 1999. Inside was a single photograph, a much younger version of himself standing beside a striking woman with dark hair and haunted eyes. Charlotte Walker had been his first private client, and if she was returning to the city after all these years, the carefully constructed house of secrets was about to collapse. Olivia sat beside Grace's hospital bed, sketching the mountains that had been haunting her dreams. The hospice room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and Grace's labored breathing. In the 3 days since their last conversation, her condition had deteriorated rapidly. The doctor said it was only a matter of time. "That's beautiful," Grace whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "Have you ever been there?" Olivia looked down at her drawing, jagged peaks rising above a pristine lake, with a small clearing where a plane might have crashed long ago. "No," she answered. "I've never been to the mountains." "You have," Grace contradicted weakly. "You just don't remember." A nurse entered with medication, interrupting their conversation. Olivia used the opportunity to step outside. Needing a moment to clear her head, the hospital corridor was bustling with activity, but she barely noticed as she made her way to a quiet alcove with vending machines. "Coffee." Olivia turned to find Benjamin Carter holding out a paper cup. She hadn't seen him approach. "Thank you," she said cautiously, accepting the offering. "But why are you here?" "I wanted to meet you properly." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Without my father present, how did you know where to find me?" Benjamin shrugged. "It wasn't difficult." Olivia remembered the camera sounds outside her apartment, the threatening text message. "You've been having me followed. I needed to understand what you want from my father. I don't want anything from him. Everyone wants something." Benjamin studied her face. "But I'm beginning to think this is more complicated than I initially assumed." Olivia took a sip of coffee to buy herself time. Unlike Michael, whose grief had softened his edges, Benjamin was all sharp angles and suspicion. Yet she sensed a vulnerability beneath his polished exterior, the wariness of someone who had been disappointed too many times. "My adoptive mother is dying," she said finally. "She recently gave me a medallion that might connect me to your family somehow. That's all I know. May I see it?" After a moment's hesitation, Olivia reached beneath her sweater and pulled out the necklace she now wore constantly. Benjamin's eyes widened slightly at the sight. "My father gave this to Sophia on their wedding day," he said. "It was believed lost in the crash that killed her. That's what Michael told me. Yet, here it is, 25 years later, around your neck." Benjamin's voice hardened. "You must understand how suspicious that looks. I'm not trying to scam your father if that's what you're implying." Olivia tucked the medallion back into her sweater. "I'm just trying to figure out who I am before the only person who might know the truth is gone." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Benjamin's posture relaxed slightly. "My father believes you may be related to us. Distantly," he said. "The granddaughter of Sophia's sister." Olivia stared at him, processing this information. "Charlotte Walker. You know the name. Grace mentioned it once. She said the woman who gave me to her was desperate, terrified." Olivia frowned. "Why would Charlotte Walker's granddaughter have Sophia's medallion?" "That's what we're trying to figure out." Benjamin hesitated. "We'd like to do a DNA test." "We? My father and I, to establish whether there's a biological connection?" Olivia considered the request. A DNA test might answer the questions that had haunted her entire life. Who she was, where she came from, why she'd been abandoned. But it could also open doors better left closed. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Benjamin nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. "For what it's worth, I hope you find the answers you're looking for." He turned to leave, then paused. "Just be careful. Not all truths are meant to set us free." In his penthouse office, Michael examined the preliminary report from the private lab. The results were inconclusive, but suggested a possible genetic connection between himself and Olivia. Not close enough to be father and daughter, but perhaps consistent with a grandniece or similar relation. He set the paper aside and moved to the window, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled over the skyline. If Olivia was indeed Ella's daughter, somehow rescued from the crash that had claimed her mother's life, it raised more questions than it answered. Why had Charlotte hidden the baby's existence? Why give the child to a stranger rather than raise her herself? And most troubling of all, why had Charlotte believed the child was in danger? The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Mr. Carter, Jack Reynolds is here to see you." Michael frowned. He hadn't summoned his driver. "Send him in." Jack entered, looking uncharacteristically uneasy. "Sir, I apologize for the intrusion, but there's something you should know." "What is it, Jack?" "It's about Miss Sophia's sister, Charlotte." Jack removed his driving cap, twisting it in his hands. "I believe I saw her today." Michael went very still. "Where?" "Outside the young lady's apartment, the one from the restaurant. I was driving past on my way to pick up your dry cleaning when I noticed her. Older now, of course, but unmistakable." "You're certain it was Charlotte?" "As certain as I can be after all these years." Jack hesitated. "There's something else. She wasn't alone. She was with that investigator Mr. Benjamin hired, Harris." Michael's blood ran cold. If Charlotte was back in the city and working with Harris, it could only mean one thing. She knew about Olivia and was watching her. But why, after 25 years of silence? What had drawn her back now? "Thank you, Jack. Not a word of this to anyone else." "Understood." After Jack left, Michael reached for his phone to call Benjamin, then stopped. His son had initiated the investigation that had apparently led Charlotte back to them, until Michael understood her motives. It might be wiser to keep this information to himself. Instead, he dialed Olivia's number. In a modest hotel room across town, Charlotte Walker stood before the bathroom mirror, studying the face that had once been identical to Sophia's. Time had carved different paths for the twins, lines of grief and guilt etching themselves deeply around Charlotte's eyes and mouth. At 68, she looked a decade older than her years. She finished applying her lipstick and stepped back, assessing the disguise she'd created. Blonde wig, tinted glasses, carefully applied makeup to alter the shape of her features. It wouldn't fool someone looking closely, but it might be enough for casual observation. A knock at the door signaled Harris's arrival. Charlotte let him in, noting the tension in his shoulders. "You were right," he said without preamble. "Benjamin Carter has ordered a DNA test." Charlotte nodded, unsurprised. "And the girl, has she agreed?" "She's considering it, but that's not our biggest problem." Harris handed her a manila envelope. "Dorothy Jenkins has resurfaced. She's been in contact with Michael." Charlotte's hand trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a surveillance photo of Dorothy leaving the old boathouse on the Carter estate. What did she tell him? Enough to make him suspicious. He knows Ella was on the plane, and that she was pregnant. Harris watched her reaction carefully. He believes Olivia is Ella's daughter, rescued from the crash. Then he doesn't know the whole truth. Charlotte sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak. "Not yet. It's only a matter of time," Harris warned. "The DNA test will show. It will show exactly what I want it to show," Charlotte interrupted. "Nothing more. You can't control DNA, Charlotte." "No, but I can control how it's interpreted." She stood, her resolve strengthening. "I need to see her. Olivia, up close. That's too risky. I've waited 25 years for this moment, William." Charlotte's voice was steel. "I won't be denied now. Arrange it." As Harris left to make the arrangements, Charlotte moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there was the girl she'd given away, the last remaining piece of a tragedy she'd set in motion with her own hands, a tragedy born of obsession, jealousy, and a love so twisted it had destroyed everything in its path. In the silence of the hotel room, Charlotte allowed herself to remember that snowy day in the mountains, the wreckage of the plane, the smell of fuel and fire, the sound of a baby crying among the devastation. She remembered cradling the infant, wiping blood from its tiny face, seeing the crescent birthmark that matched Sophia's exactly. And she remembered her own desperate prayer as she handed the child to a stranger. "Let her be nothing like me." Grace died on a Tuesday morning, slipping away peacefully in her sleep with Olivia holding her hand. She left behind a small envelope containing a key to a safety deposit box and a note. "When you're ready for the final piece of the puzzle." The funeral was small, just Olivia and a handful of Grace's former nursing colleagues. As the modest service concluded, Olivia noticed a figure standing at a distance beneath an oak tree, a woman in dark glasses and a headscarf watching intently. When their eyes met briefly, the woman turned and walked away, disappearing among the gravestones. 3 days later, Michael invited Olivia to his birthday celebration, a small gathering at his home. Rather than the lavish parties Benjamin had suggested, Olivia initially declined, feeling it inappropriate so soon after Grace's passing. But Michael insisted. "I understand grief," he told her gently. "Sometimes being alone with it is the worst thing possible." So she found herself standing before the imposing iron gates of the Carter mansion on Friday evening, clutching a wrapped package. She'd spent hours on the gift, a detailed sketch of the sunrise over the mountain landscape from her dreams. Something told her Michael would understand its significance. Jack met her at the entrance, his eyes crinkling with kindness. "Miss Olivia, the master is expecting you." The house was like something from another era. High ceilings, gleaming hardwood floors, and artwork that probably belonged in museums. Jack led her through to a sunroom overlooking gardens illuminated by tasteful landscape lighting. About 20 people mingled there, dressed in what Olivia could only assume was casual attire for the wealthy. No formal gowns, but certainly nothing from department stores. Michael spotted her immediately, excusing himself from a conversation to greet her. "You came," he said, genuine pleasure warming his voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I'm hardly dressed for the occasion." Her simple black dress, though respectful, clearly marked her as an outsider among the designer labels surrounding them. "You look perfect." Michael took her arm. "Come. There are people I'd like you to meet." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions. Michael's business associates and friends were polite but curious, their eyes lingering on her face a beat too long. Olivia overheard whispers, comparisons to Sophia, speculation about her relationship with Michael. She did her best to ignore them. Benjamin arrived late, his entrance drawing attention. He made his way directly to his father, giving Olivia a brief nod of acknowledgement. "Happy birthday, Dad." He handed over a small, exquisitely wrapped package. "Sorry I couldn't be here earlier. The Tokyo deal needed finalizing." "The company would survive one evening without you," Michael replied. But there was no real reproach in his tone. He seemed genuinely pleased to see his son. As the evening progressed, Olivia found herself gravitating toward the artwork displayed throughout the room. One painting in particular captured her attention, a landscape of snow-capped mountains with a lake nestled in the valley below. Sophia painted that. Michael said, appearing at her side. "It was her favorite place. We had a cabin there before. It's beautiful," Olivia whispered. "I've been drawing something very similar." She touched the medallion beneath her dress. "I've never been there, but it feels like I have." Michael's eyes softened. "Perhaps someday we could visit. It's still there. The cabin. I couldn't bring myself to sell it." The moment was interrupted by the soft chime of a glass being tapped. Benjamin stood in the center of the room, commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. As is tradition at these gatherings, it's time for me to embarrass my father with a speech." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Olivia noticed something clutched in Benjamin's hand. "Photographs. My father has always been a man of vision," Benjamin continued, "building Carter Enterprises from a small investment firm into the powerhouse it is today. But his greatest legacy isn't business, it's family." Benjamin's eyes flickered briefly to Olivia before returning to the crowd. "Which is why I'm so pleased to announce a recent discovery. It seems our family may be larger than we knew." Michael stiffened beside her. "Benjamin," he warned quietly. But Benjamin was already holding up the first photograph, a side-by-side comparison of Sophia and Olivia. Murmurs swept through the room. "The resemblance is striking, isn't it?" Benjamin's voice carried easily. "And not coincidental, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to introduce Olivia Watson. Preliminary DNA results suggest she's the granddaughter of Charlotte Walker, Sophia's twin sister." All eyes turned to Olivia. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and anger. This was not how she'd wanted this information shared, as a spectacle for the entertainment of strangers. "Benjamin, that's enough," Michael said firmly, stepping forward. "But I'm just getting to the interesting part," Benjamin replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You see, Olivia was found as an infant near the site of the crash that killed Sophia, and around her neck was this." He held up a photo of the medallion. The room went completely silent. The very necklace my father gave Sophia on their wedding day. The necklace that was supposedly lost in the crash. Benjamin looked directly at Olivia now. "Perhaps our guest would be kind enough to show us the actual medallion. I believe she's wearing it tonight." Olivia's hand went instinctively to her chest, where the medallion lay hidden beneath her dress. She felt ambushed, exposed, used as a prop in some family drama she didn't fully understand. "That's not necessary," Michael began, but Olivia shook her head. "It's all right." Her voice was steadier than she expected. She reached beneath her collar and pulled out the gold medallion, letting it catch the light. "Yes, this was around my neck when Grace found me. I don't know how it got there. I don't know who my birth parents were. I'm just trying to find answers, not disrupt anyone's life." An elderly woman near the back of the room gasped loudly, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the marble floor. All heads turned. "Dorothy!" Michael moved toward his former housekeeper, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" Dorothy Jenkins stood frozen, her face pale as parchment. Her eyes were fixed on the medallion gleaming at Olivia's throat. "It's not possible," she whispered. "What's not possible?" Benjamin pressed. Dorothy's gaze shifted from the medallion to Olivia's face, then to Michael's. "I never told you the whole truth, Mr. Carter, about Charlotte, about what really happened that day." Michael guided her to a chair. "What do you mean?" "The crash wasn't an accident." Dorothy's voice shook. "Charlotte, she sabotaged the plane. She confessed it to me afterward. She was obsessed with you, Mr. Carter. Always had been. Even before you chose Sophia. She thought if Sophia was gone, you'd eventually turn to her for comfort." Shocked murmurs rippled through the room. Michael's face had gone ashen. "But she never meant for Ella to be on that flight," Dorothy continued, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Ella had cut ties with her mother years before. Charlotte didn't know she'd reconciled with Sophia, that they'd planned to meet, when she realized her own daughter was on the plane too. Dorothy's voice broke. "It destroyed her." Olivia felt the room spinning around her. If Charlotte had caused the crash, and Ella was her daughter, then, "My mother," she whispered. "Ella was my mother." Dorothy nodded, her eyes full of sorrow. "You were born in the wreckage, child. Sophia helped deliver you before she died from her injuries. Charlotte arrived before emergency services. Searching for survivors, she found you and Sophia, still alive. Sophia made her promise to keep you safe. From what? Michael demanded. From the truth. A new voice answered. The crowd parted as a woman stepped forward, elegant despite her age, with sharp features and haunted eyes, without the blonde wig and dark glasses. Charlotte Walker was immediately recognizable to anyone who had known Sophia. "Hello, Michael," she said quietly. "It's been a long time." The guests dispersed quickly after Charlotte's dramatic appearance, ushered out by Jack with practiced discretion. Soon only 5 people remained in the sunroom. Michael, Benjamin, Olivia, Dorothy, and Charlotte. 25 years, Michael said, breaking the tense silence. "You disappear for 25 years after killing my wife, and now you just walk back into my home." Charlotte flinched at his words but didn't deny them. "I never meant for Sophia to die. Or Ella. It was supposed to be a minor malfunction. Enough to force an emergency landing. Time for you to realize how quickly you could lose her." "How comforting," Benjamin interjected coldly. "You only meant to terrorize them, not kill them." Charlotte's gaze shifted to Benjamin. "You look so much like your father at that age." "Don't speak to my son," Michael warned. "Don't even look at him." Olivia stood apart from them, the medallion clutched tightly in her palm. Her entire world had collapsed in the span of minutes. The woman who had given birth to her had died in a crash deliberately caused by her own grandmother. The woman who had rescued her as an infant was the same one responsible for making her an orphan. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "Why did you do it?" Charlotte turned to her, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Because I loved him. Because he chose Sophia over me. Because I was broken inside." She shook her head. "There's no justification, only explanation. I've spent 25 years trying to atone for what I did." "By hiding," Michael demanded. "By running away. By protecting Olivia," Charlotte countered. "By ensuring no one ever connected her to the crash or to me. Do you have any idea what would have happened if the truth had come out? That a baby survived? That I was responsible? She would have been consumed by the media, by the courts, by the legacy of my crime. So you gave her away," Dorothy said quietly. "To a stranger. To a good woman who would love her and keep her safe," Charlotte corrected. "I tracked Grace for years afterward, making sure Olivia was well cared for. I established a trust fund in her name. Anonymously, of course." Olivia looked up sharply. "The college fund. The distant relative Grace mentioned." Charlotte nodded. "I couldn't be part of your life, but I could ensure you had opportunities." "How generous," Benjamin said sarcastically. "After orphaning her, you sent money." "Benjamin," Michael cautioned. "Let's hear her out." Dorothy cleared her throat. "There's still one thing I don't understand, the medallion. How did it end up with Olivia?" All eyes turned to Charlotte, who seemed to age before them as she prepared to answer. "When I reached the crash site, Sophia was still alive. Barely. She had Olivia in her arms. This tiny, bloody miracle born amid the wreckage. The medallion was around Sophia's neck. She took it off and placed it around the baby's neck. Her last act." Charlotte's voice broke. She looked at me and said, "Tell Michael I'm sorry. Tell him to find happiness again." Then she was gone. Michael turned away, emotion overwhelming him. Benjamin moved to his father's side, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "I took the baby and ran," Charlotte continued. "I knew what I'd done would come to light eventually. The sabotage wouldn't be hard to trace. I couldn't risk Olivia being connected to me, to any of it." "And you never thought she deserved to know her own history?" Olivia challenged, anger finally breaking through her shock. "You let me grow up feeling abandoned, unwanted, when all along you knew exactly where I was. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself," Olivia corrected, tears streaming down her face. "Just like you're trying to do now." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice steady despite his obvious emotional strain. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to Aspen. All of us. I want to see the crash site." He looked directly at Charlotte. "And you're going to tell us everything, every detail you've been hiding for 25 years." The Aspen Mountains were breathtaking in their autumn splendor, golden aspens contrasting against the deep green of pines and the first dusting of snow on the highest peaks. Michael's private jet landed at the small regional airport just after dawn. a caravan of SUVs waited to take them the rest of the way. Olivia stared out the window during the drive, recognizing landmarks from her dreams and sketches. The particular curve of a mountain ridge, the shape of a lake reflecting the sky. Her body remembered what her mind could not. "It's all so familiar," she whispered, beside her. Michael nodded. "Sophia loved it here. We were going to build a proper home eventually. Raise our children in these mountains." The mention of children brought a fresh wave of grief. What might have been, had Charlotte's jealousy not destroyed so many lives. The vehicles could only take them so far. The final approach to the crash site required a hike up a moderate slope, covered in pine needles and loose shale. Charlotte led the way, moving with surprising agility despite her age. Dorothy had remained at the cabin, her health not permitting the challenging terrain. "It's just ahead," Charlotte called back. In that clearing, they emerged from the trees into a small natural meadow. At first glance, there was nothing to indicate tragedy had struck here. Nature had reclaimed the space, wildflowers growing among the grasses, birds calling from the surrounding pines. But as they moved further in, evidence emerged. Fragments of metal buried in the soil, exposed by years of erosion and weather. Benjamin knelt and picked up a twisted piece of aluminum. "After all this time, it's still here." Michael stood motionless, eyes closed, perhaps communing with Sophia's spirit or simply absorbing the enormity of standing where she had died. Olivia felt a strange disconnection. This was where she had been born, where her mother had died, yet she had no memory of it. "The plane hit there," Charlotte said, pointing to a scarred section of earth. "The main cabin broke apart on impact. Sophia was thrown clear, which is probably the only reason she survived long enough to—" her voice trailed off, "to give birth," Olivia finished for her. Charlotte nodded. "It was snowing. I was frantic, searching for survivors. I heard crying, your crying, and followed the sound. Sophia was propped against that rock, holding you." She pointed to a large boulder at the edge of the clearing. There was so much blood." Michael walked slowly to the boulder and placed his hand on its rough surface. "She was alone," he said, his voice breaking. "When she needed me most, I wasn't here." "She wasn't afraid," Charlotte offered softly. "She was. Peaceful, focused entirely on keeping you alive, Olivia, on making sure you were safe." Olivia approached the boulder, standing beside Michael. She could almost picture it, a dying woman cradling a newborn, transferring the medallion in a final act of love and connection. "I took you and wrapped you in my coat," Charlotte continued. "Sophia made me promise to make sure you were safe, that you would grow up loved." As I was leaving, I encountered Grace on the access road. She was visiting her sister nearby and had heard about the crash. She was a nurse, coming to offer help when I saw her. I just knew she was the right person. "And the pilot?" Benjamin asked. "Was he already dead?" Charlotte looked away. "Yes, he died on impact." "You're lying," Benjamin said flatly. "What really happened to him?" Charlotte's shoulders sagged. "He survived the crash. He saw me there, recognized me. He knew what I'd done to the plane. I couldn't let him tell anyone, not with Olivia in my arms." The implication hung heavy in the mountain air. Not just sabotage, but murder. "Does your list of crimes have any end?" Michael asked, disgust evident in his voice. Charlotte had no answer for him. She simply stood, small and defeated, in the center of the meadow that had witnessed her greatest sins. Olivia knelt and pressed her palm to the earth. "Hello, Mother," she whispered. "I'm sorry I never knew you," as the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the meadow. A gentle breeze stirred the wild flowers. For a moment, just a moment, Olivia felt a presence, warm, loving, accepting, whether it was Ella, Sophia, or simply her own heart finding peace she couldn't say. But in that mountain clearing, surrounded by the wreckage of the past, something inside her began to heal. The Carter family cabin stood on the shores of Alpine Lake, its weathered logs and stone chimney a testament to simpler tastes than the mansion back in the city. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rustic interior as night fell over the mountains. Michael sat in a leather armchair, staring into the flames. After the emotional devastation of visiting the crash site, they had retreated to the cabin, Dorothy had prepared a simple dinner that none of them had much appetite for. Now, the elderly housekeeper had retired to one of the guest rooms, leaving the others to confront the weight of all that had been revealed. "You need to turn yourself in," Benjamin said, breaking the tense silence. He stood by the window, watching Charlotte where she sat alone on the porch swing. "The authorities need to know what really happened. After 25 years, Michael's voice was hollow. What purpose would it serve? Justice, Benjamin insisted. For Sophia, for Ella, for the pilot. Justice won't bring them back. Michael finally looked away from the fire, his eyes reflecting its glow. Nothing will. Olivia sat on the hearthrug, knees drawn up to her chest. The day had left her emotionally exhausted, yet strangely calm. The truth, however painful, was better than the emptiness of not knowing. "What are you thinking?" Michael asked her gently. "I'm thinking about my mother, Ella," Olivia replied. "About what kind of person she was. To seek reconciliation with Sophia after whatever falling out she had with Charlotte. About how she must have felt. Learning she was pregnant, wanting to share that with family." Michael nodded. "Sophia mentioned her in her letters. She was worried about Ella. Said she'd cut ties with Charlotte and was struggling. Sophia wanted to help her. That's why she was on the plane," Olivia realized. "To accept Sophia's help." "Yes." Michael's gaze returned to the fire. "Your mother must have been a brave woman, to break away from Charlotte's influence, to reach out to Sophia." Benjamin moved away from the window. "Charlotte's coming inside." The door opened, admitting a blast of cool mountain air and Charlotte's diminutive figure. She had aged a decade in a day, her shoulders hunched with the burden of her confessions. "The stars are out," she said quietly. "I'd forgotten how bright they are up here." No one responded. Charlotte moved to the fireplace, holding her hands out to the warmth. "There's something else you should know," she said after a moment. "Something I've kept hidden all these years." Michael laughed bitterly. "More secrets, Charlotte. I'm not sure I can take any more of your revelations." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather-bound book, its edges charred and pages warped from water damage. "Sophia's journal. I took it from the wreckage." Michael stared at the journal, his expression one of disbelief and longing. He reached for it with trembling hands. "I was told everything was destroyed in the fire." "Not everything," Charlotte said. "I've kept it all these years. It was my penance in a way. Reading her words, being reminded daily of what I'd destroyed." Michael opened the journal carefully, its fragile pages threatening to crumble at his touch. His eyes filled with tears as he recognized Sophia's elegant handwriting. "Why give it to me now?" he asked, voice thick with emotion. "Because it contains her last wishes," Charlotte replied. "Wishes I've prevented you from fulfilling for 25 years. Michael began to read silently, tears streaming unchecked down his face. After several minutes, he looked up, his expression transformed. "She knew," he whispered. "Somehow, she knew she might not have much time." "What does it say?" Benjamin asked, moving closer. Michael cleared his throat. "If anything should ever happen to me," he read, "know that my greatest wish is for Michael to find happiness again, not to live forever in grief, but to open his heart once more. Life is too precious, too brief to waste in mourning what cannot be changed." The words hung in the air, Sophia's voice seemingly present among them. Olivia felt a tear slide down her cheek, moved by the generosity of spirit from a woman she would never know. "I failed her," Michael said, closing the journal gently. "I've spent 25 years locked in grief, pushing away everyone, including my own son." He looked at Benjamin, regret etched deeply in his features. "I'm sorry." Benjamin's usual composure faltered. For a moment, he looked like the boy he had once been, desperate for his father's attention and approval. "It's not too late," he said quietly. Charlotte watched this exchange with a mixture of sorrow and something else. Relief, perhaps, at seeing some healing begin amid the wreckage she had caused. "There's more," she said, "about Ella, about her child." All eyes turned to her. Sophia wrote that if anything happened to both her and Ella, she wanted any children they might have to know love, to know their family history, the good parts. Charlotte looked directly at Olivia. "She made me promise that if the worst happened, I would make sure Michael knew about Ella's baby, that you would be raised as part of the family." A promise you broke, Michael said flatly. Yes. Charlotte didn't try to defend herself. I convinced myself I was protecting Olivia from the scandal, from the pain of knowing her grandmother was a murderer. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I couldn't bear to face what I'd done. To face you, Michael. And now, Olivia asked, why come forward after all this time? Because I'm dying, Charlotte said simply. Cancer. The same kind that took Grace. I have months, at most. I couldn't leave this world with these secrets still buried. The revelation silenced them all. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the pines surrounding the cabin. I don't expect forgiveness, Charlotte continued after a moment. I don't deserve it, but I want to make what amends I can in the time I have left. How? Michael asked, his voice devoid of warmth. How do you amend destroying so many lives? Charlotte reached into her pocket again and withdrew a USB drive. This contains my full confession. Every detail of what I did and why, names of people who helped me cover it up, evidence that might still exist, bank records showing the trust fund I established for Olivia. She placed it on the coffee table. Do with it what you will. Benjamin picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. You realize this is enough to send you to prison for what remains of your life. Yes. Even if we believe you're dying, the law may not be so forgiving. Charlotte nodded. I understand. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come. Olivia, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly stood. I need some air. She slipped outside, leaving the others to their moral calculations. The night was crisp, stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky. Olivia walked to the edge of the lake, its surface mirroring the constellations above. This was where she came from. These mountains, this tragedy, these broken people. All her life she had longed to know her origins, and now that she did, the knowledge was almost too heavy to bear. After a few minutes, she heard footsteps behind her, expecting Michael. She was surprised to turn and find Benjamin standing there, hands thrust deep in his pockets against the cold. I thought you might want company, he said awkwardly. Olivia nodded, returning her gaze to the lake. They stood in silence for a moment. I'm sorry, Benjamin finally said, for how I treated you, for suspecting you were trying to con my father, and for ambushing you at the party. You were trying to protect him, Olivia replied. I understand that now. Not just him. Benjamin's voice softened. I was protecting myself too, from having to share him, from having to acknowledge how badly our relationship has deteriorated over the years. Olivia glanced at him. In the moonlight, Benjamin looked younger, more vulnerable than the sharp-suited businessman she had first encountered. What happens now? She asked. With Charlotte, with her confession. Benjamin sighed, the sound dissolving into the night air. I don't know. Part of me wants justice, wants her to spend whatever time she has left paying for what she did. But another part recognizes that more punishment won't heal anything. Olivia finished for him. Exactly. He looked at her with newfound respect. How are you so calm about all this? She's responsible for your mother's death, for you growing up without your family. Olivia considered the question carefully. I think it's because I finally understand where I come from. The empty space inside me has been filled, not with what I would have chosen, but with truth, and truth, however painful, is better than the void of not knowing. From the cabin porch, Michael watched his son and Olivia talking by the lakeside. Despite everything, a fragile sense of possibility stirred within him. Sophia's words from the journal echoed in his mind. Life is too precious, too brief to waste in mourning what cannot be changed. For the first time in 25 years, Michael Carter felt the weight of grief begin to lift, replaced by something he had thought lost forever: hope. 6 months passed like the turning of seasons, each day bringing small but significant changes to the lives touched by the revelations in the mountains. Charlotte Walker submitted her full confession to the authorities. Given her terminal diagnosis, confirmed by multiple specialists, she was placed under house arrest rather than incarcerated. She spent her remaining time cooperating with investigators, helping to close not only the case of Flight 2216, but also providing information about the pilot's death. Classified for decades as an accident, on a crisp spring morning, The Carter Foundation for the Arts opened its doors to the public for the first time. The converted warehouse in the city's arts district featured soaring ceilings, abundant natural light, and gallery spaces dedicated to emerging artists. At its heart stood a permanent exhibition titled Reflections, a collection of Sophia's paintings displayed alongside new works by contemporary artists, exploring themes of loss, memory, and rebirth. Olivia stood in the central gallery, making final adjustments to the exhibition she had curated as the Foundation's newly appointed director. She had thrown herself into the project with passion and vision, transforming Michael's initial concept into something truly remarkable. "Nervous?" Benjamin asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. "Terrified," Olivia admitted, accepting one of the cups. "What if nobody comes?" Benjamin laughed. "The guest list includes 3 mayors, a governor, and half the art world. I think we're covered." Their relationship had evolved over the months, from suspicion to grudging respect to genuine friendship. Benjamin had been the one to suggest Olivia for the director position, recognizing her innate talent for connecting with artists and understanding their work. "Is your father here yet?" Olivia asked, checking her watch. "In his office upstairs. He's on a call with the Tokyo office, but he promised to be down before the doors open." Olivia nodded and moved toward a particular painting, one of Sophia's landscapes showing the view from the cabin in Aspen. Beside it hung one of Olivia's own works, depicting the same scene from a slightly different angle. The similarity in style and sensibility was striking, a visual echo that seemed to transcend genetics. "It's uncanny," Benjamin said softly, following her gaze. "The way you capture light, just like she did." "I never had formal training," Olivia mused. "Grace couldn't afford art classes, but I always felt," she struggled to find the words, "like someone was guiding my hand." "Maybe someone was." Michael's voice came from behind them. He approached slowly, taking in the paired paintings. "Sophia would have loved this place, and she would have been proud of what you've created here." "Olivia," the 3 stood in contemplative silence, united by a shared history that, while rooted in tragedy, had somehow blossomed into something meaningful. "It's time," Benjamin said eventually, checking his phone. "The press is gathering outside." Michael nodded. "You 2 go ahead. I need a moment," as Benjamin and Olivia walked toward the entrance. Michael remained before the paintings, lost in thought. The past 6 months had been a journey through grief he had postponed for 25 years. Reading Sophia's journal had finally allowed him to hear her voice again, to understand her final wishes, to begin the process of letting go. And in that letting go, he had found something unexpected, the chance to rebuild his relationship with his son, and to forge a new connection with Olivia, this remarkable young woman who carried echoes of his past, but was entirely her own person. The medallion gleamed at Olivia's throat as she addressed the gathered crowd. Welcoming them to the Foundation's opening, Michael had insisted she keep it, a tangible link to Sophia and Ella, a reminder of the love that had given her life even in the midst of tragedy. "The Carter Foundation for the Arts was born from loss," Olivia was saying, her voice clear and confident. "But its purpose is celebration, of creativity, of connection, of the human capacity to transform pain into beauty." Behind the crowd, barely noticed among the well-dressed patrons, stood Dorothy Jenkins. Despite her age and frailty, she had insisted on attending, wanting to witness this moment of healing. Beside her sat Charlotte in a wheelchair, thin and gray but clear-eyed, granted temporary leave from her house arrest on compassionate grounds. As Olivia continued her speech, outlining the Foundation's mission to support young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds, she caught Charlotte's eye briefly. There was no warmth in the exchange, no forgiveness. Some wounds were too deep for that, but there was acknowledgement, a recognition that from the wreckage of the past, something worthwhile had emerged. After the speeches and the ceremonial ribbon cutting, the crowd dispersed throughout the galleries. Michael found himself drawn back to Sophia's paintings, particularly one he had never fully understood, an abstract work showing a medallion surrounded by swirling patterns of light. "She painted that the week before the crash," Charlotte said quietly, her wheelchair stopping beside him. "She told me it came to her in a dream, that the medallion would find its way back to you someday, bringing light with it." Michael glanced down at the dying woman who had once been his sister-in-law. who had loved him with such destructive obsession that she had destroyed both their lives. "Why did you hate her so much?" he asked, the question that had haunted him for decades. Charlotte shook her head slowly. "I never hated Sophia. I hated myself for not being her, for not being the one you chose." She looked up at the painting. "In the end, she was right. The medallion did find its way back to you, and it did bring light." "Olivia." Before Michael could respond, Benjamin approached, tension evident in his posture. "The prosecutor is here, Charlotte. It's time to go." Charlotte nodded, accepting her fate with quiet dignity. As Benjamin wheeled her away, she spoke once more over her shoulder. "Check the back of the medallion, Michael. There's a hidden compartment. Sophia wanted you to find it when the time was right." Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the staff had gone home, Michael, Benjamin, and Olivia sat in the small courtyard behind the foundation building. The spring night was mild, stars visible despite the city lights. "I think we can call today a success," Benjamin said, loosening his tie. "The endowment is fully funded. The press coverage was excellent, and we've already received inquiries about hosting similar exhibitions in other cities. It's more than I ever imagined," Olivia admitted. "Thank you both for trusting me with this." Michael smiled, the expression coming more naturally to him these days. "The foundation is your vision as much as mine." "Olivia, I just provided the resources." "Speaking of resources," Benjamin began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about the cabin in Aspen. It's been sitting empty except for our visit last fall. What if we turned it into a retreat for artists? A place where they could work surrounded by the same mountains that inspired Sophia?" Michael considered the idea, surprised by how right it felt. "I think she would have loved that." Olivia reached for the medallion at her throat, a gesture that had become habitual. "Charlotte mentioned something today about a hidden compartment." Michael nodded. "I've been meaning to look at it." Olivia unclasped the chain and handed him the medallion. Michael examined it carefully, finally discovering a nearly invisible seam along the edge. With gentle pressure, the backplate separated, revealing a tiny folded paper inside. His hands trembling slightly, Michael unfolded it, revealing Sophia's delicate handwriting. "My dearest Michael, if you're reading this, I'm gone, but love like ours is never truly lost. It transforms. It finds new paths, new expressions. Don't lock your heart away. One day, this medallion will return to you, bringing with it a chance for healing. When that day comes, embrace it with courage. Remember me with joy, not sorrow. Live fully. Love again. I'll be watching over you always, eternally yours, Sophia." The three sat in stunned silence, the weight of Sophia's foresight settling over them. "How could she have known?" Benjamin whispered. "She didn't," Michael replied, carefully refolding the note. "But she understood that love finds a way, even beyond death, even through the most unlikely channels." He looked at Olivia, this young woman who had entered their lives through such extraordinary circumstances, who carried the bloodline of the Walker twins, but was entirely her own person. "Family isn't always what we expect," he said softly. "Sometimes it's what we build from the ruins of what was lost." As the night deepened around them, the three remained in the courtyard, sharing stories, making plans, weaving together the threads of their intertwined lives. Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky, brief, brilliant, transformative, just like love itself.